Kia ora, and welcome to Aotearoa's Opportunity, a podcast where we talk about fair pay agreements and how they can help us tackle some of Aotearoa's most urgent issues.
In this podcast, everyday workers will be sharing their stories about the issues that they deal with in their industries and how we can discuss solutions that FBAs will have to offer.
So, no mai, haere mai, and welcome to Aotearoa's Opportunity.
One of the big things that we talked about was how New Zealand doesn't have very productive industries because we don't invest in them properly. We just sort of do, low-cost industries. We don't have decent industries like the Australians, like the Scandinavians, the Europeans, where they really create a workforce that's able to meet the challenges of the industries coming forward, rather than just paying the cheapest. The bus industry is a great example because here's an industry which is incredibly important to New Zealand. This is public transport. We've actually had a situation where those bus companies have been struggling to attract labour because they've driven the conditions so badly they can't attract bus drivers. Then the bus companies can't basically fulfil the tenders and operate all the routes. Then people start saying, my bus is cancelled again, and then people lose confidence in it.
On today's episode, we're going to be talking with the CTU President, Richard Wagstaff. We'll discuss how fair pay agreements came about, the benefits that they'll provide, and the process of how we get fair pay agreements passed. Richard Wagstaff has over 30 years' experience in the union movement. He started working as a union researcher and organiser and has also spent time as the National Secretary of New Zealand's largest union, the Public Service Association. Thanks for joining us today, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
So, to start off, can you tell us a little bit about the purpose of fair pay agreements and also how they came to exist in Aotearoa?
Yeah, I think what we recognise as unions is that really since the introduction of the Employment Contracts Act, there was a big gap in our employment legislation. And we've had a situation where whole industries can no longer bargain and only unions can bargain enterprise by enterprise or people can bargain individually, which means there's great big gaps throughout the labour market, and it means that we can't really ever lift the standard properly. And so we looked at other countries, particularly European nations, Scandinavian nations. We looked at Australia, and we said, how come they're managing to get decent standards across industries and we're not? And what we found was those countries had mechanisms like the modern award system in Australia or other extended bargaining systems in Europe, which allowed them to really lift a whole industry and lift the conditions of a whole industry. So we needed to create something like that in New Zealand. And as soon as the Labour government was elected nearly 6 years ago, what they did was they created a working group, which I was a member of, and the ex-Prime Minister was also chairing. And what we did with Business New Zealand and some officials and the CTU, we said, how do we attend to this problem of having this gap in our employment law? How do we create something that stops people falling through and stopping that race to the bottom? And we created this thing called fair pay agreements, a proposal for it, and the government later legislated that proposal to come into existence. And what it means is that whole industries can set minimum standards for the workforce under which nobody can fall, whereas at the moment there is no minimum floor that people can fall through.
And it's not always been that way, has it? We had something like this in New Zealand previously.
Oh, absolutely. For decades, right up until the Contracts Act of 1991, we had a system of an award system where if you worked in an occupation in a certain industry, you had to be paid at a certain rate or above. You couldn't fall below it. And the beauty of that is it stops businesses competing against each other on the cost of labour and therefore going right down to a minimum wage. It says to them that if you've got certain types of people, you have to employ them at least at a minimum rate. And so it's a very important sort of institution within the whole labour market system.
So actually that period of time when there hasn't been a system like that in a way has been the anomaly for more time than not. We've had a system like this. And
we've been the anomaly, compared to other countries. As I said, the best example is the Australian modern award system, which has, a whole plethora of minimum rates and standards for workers in different occupations and different industries that basically creates a floor over and above which people can set their own conditions.
So what's going to be different about this for an individual worker?
If you think about a lot of workers out there today in these industries, it's just not really easy or even realistic for them to say, I want to negotiate with my colleagues and be in a collective approach to bargaining. Really scary. Yeah. Or I want a pay rise, or I want better overtime rates or something. It's really not often not very welcome. No. Employers don't like to hear their staff do that. Their staff know that. They feel a bit, they don't feel good about raising these issues. But with an FPA, we're doing it for everybody. There is nobody's being called out as though they're being aggressive or somehow upsetting anybody. Everybody's doing it together. So there's sort of safety and strength in numbers. Yeah. But also your employer can't say to you, well, I can't afford it because I'll go out of business, because every employer has to pay the same rates. So there's no kind of risk of you somehow or your employer saying this is impossible for me to survive in business. What they know is that everyone else in the same businesses who they compete with have to pay the same rates. So there's no disadvantage. And in fact, employers who want to lift their rates, it's a whole lot easier for them because they don't have to worry about being undercut. So, it does change the equation. And I know there's a lot of people who are quite vulnerable in their work and they don't want to be feeling like they're doing what their boss doesn't want them to do, but they're entitled to a better pay rate, and it makes it much easier for them to ask.
And it's just going to become the cost of doing business in those industries.
Exactly.
In the same way that there are certain costs if you're, buying food to sell in a restaurant. The cost of the food is set for you. The cost of labour is going to be more set than it is
absolutely,
now.
Absolutely. And it'll be a rate that is negotiated between the workers of that industry and the employers of that industry. So it'll make sense. So each fair pay agreement will be different. They'll be tailored to and styled to a particular industry and set of circumstances. So they'll be highly relevant, they'll be worked through, and they'll be settled as something that hopefully workers will see as acceptable and employers will say it's a fair deal, and it'll be a good way forward for the rest of the industry.
Yeah, right. And so, how could you use fair pay agreements to fix issues in different industries? How might they be used to solve some of those problems?
Well, in industries where you've got, particularly in industries where you've got a situation where employers compete against each other to win contracts or tenders, and they do it on the price of labour, that's an ideal place to have a fair pay agreement to hold the minimum standard for a particular occupation. The best example I can think of is in the bus industry. And here in Wellington, we've seen it play out really badly for bus drivers, where companies have tendered or competed for council contracts to provide bus routes around Wellington. Those tender documents have said they need to name exactly how many buses there'll be, exactly how many seats they'll have, exactly what times they'll be and where they'll be. Even the fabric of the seats was stipulated in the tender document. But the one thing that wasn't was the biggest cost of all, the cost of labour. Right. So the company that had a union agreement that was above the minimum wage and had some decent standards for overtime and weekend nights and stuff, effectively had no chance of ever winning the tender, because other companies would come in and bid for that work, but without any union agreement. So they didn't have any minimum standard except the minimum wage. And so they would always undercut the existing provider. And so that's exactly what happened in Wellington. We had contracts and tenders would beat existing tenders that wouldn't provide for weekend rates, night rates, overtime rates, all those things that the union contract had in it. So what we had is this constant race to the bottom every time a tender would come up. And in effect, that happens right across the New Zealand economy. You've always got a situation where people without decent employment agreements, without decent unions, can outbid at lower costs than existing providers and keep driving the cost of wages and also other conditions of employment down.
So it seems that those employers are actually trying to do the right thing by paying their workers fairly and providing those other conditions and those sort of, protections and doing all of the good stuff that we like to see from employers, are actually being kind of punished by the current situation. And this might be a way of stopping that dynamic.
Absolutely. And in fact, we know a lot of employers, they want to pay more, but they can't, because if they do, they'll end up getting beaten by low-cost competitors. And therefore the whole industry can't lift up, because it keeps getting dragged back down every time and there's a competitive process going on. In fact, in Wellington, the bus drivers, when they were locked out by their employer in collective bargaining, and the employer said explicitly, hey, don't take it personally or badly, but we can't win another contract unless we cut your conditions. And the only way to force you to cut your conditions is to lock you out and insist on gutting your collective agreement. So, you couldn't get a more explicit situation than that. And it drove, actually, the council was very disappointed. Obviously the workers were hugely affronted and felt really attacked by that. And the company, which was a venture capital company, was very much like, hey, it's just about the money. And with this system we have in place, which promotes competition on wages, we have got to cut your wages. So without a standard, that's what will keep happening. And so the ideal places to do fair pay agreements is those places where there's a fierce competition between businesses for business, where the cost of labour is a major contributor. And transport's a great example, but there are many, many others. Supermarkets, cleaners, security.
I'm thinking of like hospitality as well, right?
Hospitality, absolutely. And there's numerous ones. And what it can be a situation of, as I described, or you might even have quite an established industry where those established players just don't want to be pulled backwards by some new entrant who pays badly. They actually want to lift an industry with better conditions, better training, better health and safety, better productivity, but they're always at risk by low-cost providers of services and being undercut by them.
Yeah, right. You talked before about in the bus industry, the sort of the fact that there were collective agreements that those drivers had. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between a collective agreement and how that works and who that covers, and a fair pay agreement and how that will work and who it'll cover?
Yeah, for sure. So a collective agreement is an agreement that involves all union members and their employer, and they negotiate it as one.
Okay.
So when the union goes and negotiates with an employer people's conditions of work, their employment agreement, that's called a collective agreement, and only unions make collective agreements.
And they're all within one company or one sort of business?
Yeah, sometimes you have multi-employer agreements, but usually, like the nurses used to have one across New Zealand for when there were DHBs, now there's just one employer, but it's always, a collective agreement is always a union agreement. That's how unions negotiate. If you're not in a union, you have an individual employment agreement. Again, so an individual can negotiate an employment agreement, although we know that most individuals just don't get to negotiate it, it's just given to them. So a collective agreement is negotiated separately. A fair pay agreement is a set of minimums. You can't be employed on a fair pay agreement. You still have to be employed lawfully with an employment agreement, either an individual one or a collective one. Now, we're going to negotiate that fair pay agreement collectively, in other words, as a group, and unions are going to lead that on behalf of all workers. So one of the great things about fair pay agreements is that it's going to bring the experience of collective bargaining to the whole workforce. Union, non-union, everybody's going to have a turn at being with their colleagues and jointly deciding, collectively deciding, what is it that we want, and deciding whether it's good enough and agreeing to accept it or take further negotiations. Collective bargaining for a collective agreement is very similar, except it's just for union members, and it's not a set of minimums. It is the employment agreement for those workers. So those two things will lie beside each other. There'll always be this, once we have fair pay agreements, there'll always be this minimum floor, and everybody who negotiates their collective agreement or their individual agreement has to be on or above that FPA. We would expect that when we go into bargain for a collective agreement, we're looking to lift the standard and it will be higher than an FPA. The important thing, though, for union members is that not only is there a big advantage in having an FPA to allow them to sort of springboard above and get a better collective, but they don't have to worry so much about bottom feeder employers who are low payers undermining their employer and their agreement by undercutting them and forcing a race to the bottom. It removes that race to the bottom so that we can go into collective bargaining and not have the employer say, if we give you that, we'll never get any more business. It'll just be a lot more safer for us to get better conditions because there won't be the same threat of people being undercut because there'll be an FPA standard which will be, much, much better than it currently is.
So when you're going into collective bargaining, you're not going to be having to fight just to stay in the same place, because there'll be those minimum protections that are kind of holding that line, and you can use your collective bargaining to actually lift further those conditions.
Yeah, and if you take that example of the Wellington situation, where the employer locked out those workers when they were collective bargaining, they said, "You're not coming back to work until you take this worst deal." That sort of pressure will be gone with an FPA because there'll be a standard that their competitors have to meet too. So it'll be easy for them to do better and not worry about being undercut.
So everyone is still going to be covered by either an individual agreement or preferably a collective agreement.
Yes.
But the people in those industries that end up having fair pay agreements, all of their terms and conditions will have to be at or above the conditions that are in the fair pay agreement.
That's right. So every time when people renegotiate their individuals and collectives, they'll have to make sure that every single thing in it is at or above the FPA.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it'll be unlawful.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. It seems that this means that there are going to be a lot of people who will possibly for the first time ever get to experience the benefit of being a part of collective bargaining through the fair pay agreement process. What are some of the other benefits of fair pay agreements which workers can expect?
Well, I think, that one you say is really important, that we let workers actually talk to each other and share the issues that they have and share their experiences, their concerns and what they're trying to achieve. What we think we have the ability to do now is, now that we've got a whole industry of workers speaking with one voice, is to say to employers, to funders like councils and others, how do we make this a better industry as a whole? How do we create a place that really is a good place to work, that has a career, that has good health and safety, decent training, has a whole myriad of important things that make a good job. At the moment, when everyone's sort of in a race to the bottom or scattered, some negotiating, some taking what they can get, some just with no real voice, we can't really lift the profession of whatever people are in. We can't lift that job to be in a higher place. We can't talk about the more longer term strategic issues. And in fact, when we were in the Fair Pay Agreement working group chaired by Jim Bolger, one of the big things that we talked about, and especially actually Jim Bolger, was how New Zealand doesn't have very productive industries because we don't invest in them properly. We just sort of do, low-cost industries. Yeah. We don't have decent industries like the Australians, like the Scandinavians, the Europeans, where they really create a workforce that's able to meet the challenges of that of the industries coming forward, rather than just paying the cheapest and getting the cheapest workforce. This is about really building the workforce and hopefully leading to better jobs, more productivity, lower emissions, higher skill, higher wage.
That sounds really exciting and like a thing that the economy needs in general.
Absolutely. And without an industry conversation, in other words, without fair pay agreements, we can't do it.
Yeah.
We can't have that conversation effectively.
Yeah. Can you think of situations where if we had those industry conversations happening already that we would have benefited from that kind of industry coordination?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, the bus industry is a great example because here's an industry which is incredibly important to New Zealand. This is public transport. This is how we reach a low emissions economy. This is how we keep people travelling in COVID, moving around. This is how we, really, it's a vital link to keep our economies, our cities, our whole society operating. It's a really important aspect of how we operate as a society. We really need to develop our public transport system so that people can get around easily in a way that's efficient, effective, and the people and that industry can attract people to do it. We've actually had a situation where those bus companies have been struggling to attract labour because they've driven the conditions so badly they can't attract bus drivers. Then the bus companies can't basically fulfil the tenders and operate all the routes. Then people start seeing, my bus is cancelled again, and then people lose confidence in it. And it takes years to build confidence up in your routes because people just start saying, I can't afford to miss the bus, I'll take the car, and then all the problems mushroom. Then people stop using buses and it just spirals. And so that's a really good example of a much more investment approach that needs to be taken to the workforce and to the industry to lift it instead of just a low-cost cost-cutting attitude, which is what we've had with a no FPA and minimum standard sort of attitude.
And so many people who rely on buses and public transport will have experienced
Absolutely.
that personally, and the frustration of not being able to rely on that really important industry.
Yeah, and my impression from, around Wellington, for example, is that most people who use those buses want the bus drivers to be treated properly.
Yeah.
Were absolutely appalled when they were locked out and the way they were treated and the service they provide. But here they were in this equation which just really was holding them down and really did a lot of damage to the whole profession of bus driving.
You mentioned COVID before as well. That strikes me as a time also when we very quickly needed to be able to coordinate within particular industries, and having those frameworks in place to support that would have probably been quite useful.
Definitely. And the thing about an FPA and these kinds of approaches, industry approaches, it means the workforce of a whole industry can have a voice. If we're not allowed to get together to talk amongst ourselves and to ask for things and to have a voice, it won't get taken into account. So when COVID struck, there are a lot of issues around health and safety, around the spread of the virus, around containment, all those things, dealing with the public, huge number of issues. If we had a much broader industry process of where workers were represented with a collective voice like we can with FPAs, I think we would have had a much more efficient and effective approach and way of protecting the drivers' interests and having their voice in the decisions that were made to keep that service running.
Yeah, fantastic. So for people who might not be as familiar with the detail around fair pay agreements and who might be expecting to be covered by an FPA at some point, how is the process of an FPA going to work? A number of FPAs have been greenlit. What happens next once that's happened, and how did they get to that point of being greenlit? Could you walk us through sort of from start to finish what the process of an FPA is?
I'll give it a shot.
Yeah.
So what happens is that FPAs are initiated by unions. And what we're doing as unions is identifying what we think are the key industries that would benefit from an FPA most. And we've already started and we've set out a number of those: bus drivers, hospitality workers, supermarket workers, cleaners, security, early childhood, and the list is growing. So in those industries, what we had to do was get at least 1,000 people.
Okay. Or
10% of the industry. In those cases, we've got 1,000 people who have all signed and agreed to be part of an initiation. So we've presented more than 1,000 signatures to MB and said we want an FPA for this industry or for that industry.
And MB's the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment.
Yeah, Public Service Department.
Yeah.
And they've had to sort of verify, are they real, those signatures? Do these people, is this a legitimate request for an FPA?
Okay.
Do they all work in the industry? Have they described that industry properly? Because that can be quite tricky, actually.
Yeah.
And are these people in it, and are they still in it, and do they really want one, or did they sign this document not knowing what they're doing?
Yeah.
And so they literally have a look at it, ring up some of the people to see if it was all explained properly, and then they tell us, yes, you've initiated properly that FPA, and that's happened for a number of them now, and bus drivers, I use the example again, were the first.
Yeah.
So once we are told that it's been properly initiated, and then employers are, and the union who initiated it, it's always one of the unions, in that case it was First Union, they wrote to all the employers that they knew of in the industry and said, we've got a fair pay agreement representing these people. This is for your information. We look forward to negotiating with you and your association, and they're required then to supply the union with all of the names and contact details or email addresses of all of the workers they employ, whether they're union members or not. That makes no distinction, and supply those to the union so the union can start talking to them.
Okay.
And so that's quite a big step, and so it's a really important part. And then what happens is, so the union gets hold of all that information, and then they start communicating with, and that's what we've been doing, with all the people covered and saying, hi, we're here, we're going to negotiate this FPA, we want to talk to you about what do we want.
Yeah.
What are the things that we want? There are some things we have to talk about. The law says that. We have to talk about pay, we have to talk about hours of work, we have to talk about weekend rates, night rates, health and safety training. There's sort of 6 or 8 things we have to talk about.
Yeah.
So we're going to not just email people, but we're going to hopefully meet with a lot of people in person.
Okay.
There's provision for paid meetings. People can come and meet and get 2 hours pay, and come to a meeting for up to 2 hours and get paid for it.
Yeah, wow.
And discuss with us, with the unions, what is it that we want, and get some agreement on what we're going to take into negotiations. Who's going to take it to negotiations? We also got to form a little bargaining side, a team, and we want to talk to the group about who's going to take that to negotiations.
Okay.
The employers have to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So they have to get together,
Yeah.
form a bargaining side, and get themselves ready for negotiations and work out what they want to.
Yeah.
We're going to do the same thing, and then we get into the room, and hopefully we negotiate a fair pay agreement, a set of conditions that are a minimum floor for that industry.
Mm-hmm.
There's somebody from the mediation service, from MB, who run that, who will be there to assist us.
Okay.
And the idea is that once we've got what we think is a good agreement, we go back to everybody who we represent, all of those people who gave us their names, and we say, this is how we got on. Do you agree, or that we should agree to this? Is this a good idea? So it's got to be voted on, and if a majority of people say yes, let's do it, we'll go back to the employer and say, we agree, where do we sign? The employer has to do the same thing with their people. If both sides agree, we've got an FPA. If one side doesn't agree, we go back into negotiations to try to find out and fix the thing that stopped us agreeing. And it goes back out to ratification again. If both sides agree, obviously there's agreement. If one side or both sides again don't agree, we don't go into negotiations anymore. It just goes to a third party, what we call arbitration, and a third party will look at both sides through a process of discussing it with them and just make a determination. In other words, just say, this is the new FPA. I'm just setting it out.
They'll listen to both sides and say, this is
and
the
that becomes a
decision.
legal standard. Yeah.
And that ratification is a vote, and everyone, regardless of whether they're a union member or not, will get to participate in that ratification.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about people who might not have experienced what it is to, be a part of collective bargaining before, this might be a new experience for people actually being able to vote on terms and conditions that are going to apply to them and impact their work.
Definitely. It is a taste of collective bargaining in a way, but it's slightly different, and obviously we expect people to do both. But yeah, it's very important, and it's really important that people understand it's not just their right, but it's their interest to be part of this, not to let it go past without them. We're talking about their conditions of work. We can't achieve things for them if we don't know what they are. So please, if you're covered by an FPA and you're invited to come and attend a meeting, make sure you do. You'll be paid for it, and you can see what your colleagues think too, and you can discuss with them. What is it that we want, and give the negotiators the support and instruction, if you like, as to what you want them to do.
It's a really exciting opportunity to be a part of that process, and actually, probably for a lot of people, have more of a say over their working conditions than they might have ever experienced before. I'm thinking back to when I worked in hospitality when I was at university. There was no say. It was, here's your contract.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's it. For a lot of people, it's going to be quite a big change, which is pretty cool.
And everyone's doing it together.
Yeah.
Everyone, and so when you're doing this with all the rest of the workforce, you're all standing together, and you're all going to get a change together. You can't be singled out. This new standard, you can't opt out of it.
Yeah.
Everybody's covered by it. If you're in any occupation where there's an FPA, it's your minimum standard.
So whether you vote on it or not, it's still going to apply to you. So there's really a lot of reason to vote, to actually have your say in it.
Absolutely. Whether you participate or not, it'll happen. But we want you to participate to make it better. We don't want to do this without the say-so and support of the workforce, because otherwise it just doesn't feel right. We like to be knowing that we're representing people's interests and we've heard from them directly.
And so before you get to that point of voting on the outcome, there's opportunity as well earlier on to sort of have a say and to shape what actually goes into that bargaining process.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. I mean, we'll set the initial email from the unions will normally be, hi, we're here, we're doing this. You'll be hearing more from us kind of thing.
Yeah.
But over time, that'll be please come to these meetings or let us know if you have any thoughts and so forth. But it's really good to get into a conversation with others. I find that those are the most productive ones. So in-person meetings are great if you can, or join the meetings on Teams or Zoom too.
Yeah.
But so you can have some dialogue, not just a one-way traffic. It's good to have questions and answers and discussion.
Yeah.
Really, really important that people get into that. And it might apply to you it'll apply to you if you're covered, whether you participate or not. But actually, it's better if you own it and make it yours by participating. It'll help the negotiators get a better deal.
Yeah. Oh, that's really, really exciting. Definitely would encourage everyone then to participate in those processes as they're happening. I'm interested to know your thoughts as well on the future of fair pay agreements.
Well, obviously, we think this is a very exciting time to forge a new path in employment relations in New Zealand. We are an outlier around the world. We are on the extreme of having no industry settings. We need something like this. I would hope this is when New Zealand's really rejoining the rest of the OECD and countries that we'd like to compare ourselves to, that we sort of start operating like them and giving workers a better deal in this country. Unfortunately, not everybody thinks like me and you, and employers. Business New Zealand has made it clear that they'll be getting rid of they'll do everything they can to stop fair pay agreements. They've tried really hard this far. They tried to take it up at the International Labour Organisation, who threw out their kind of claims that there was something wrong. Yeah. They've lobbied hard. Like we often say to employers, Australian companies are more profitable than New Zealand ones are. They're more successful. They have, if you like, their version of fair pay agreements. These are not a barrier to good work and good business. Yeah. They're actually an asset of it. We've got to get away from this low-cost sort of mentality that's been plaguing the workforce for so long in New Zealand.
Yeah. Awesome. Hey, thanks so much for your time today, Richard. We really appreciate it and look forward to talking to you again soon.